Welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very happy, very honored to bring the conversation I had with the brilliant Emily Falk. Emily is professor of communication, psychology, marketing, and operations, information, and decisions at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also the director of Communication Neuroscience Lab, the vice dean of the Annenberg School for Communication, and the director of the Climate Communication Division of the Annenberg Public Policy Center. She has a bachelor's in neuroscience from Brown University and a PhD in psychology from the University of California, Los Angeles. Her research focuses on psychology, neuroscience, and communication to examine what makes messages pervasive, why and how ideas spread, and what helps people get on the same page when communicating. Her research has been recognized by numerous awards, and she is the author of many books, including the latest, What We Value, the Neuroscience of Choice and Change. I was very excited to talk with her about this book. It's very good, and we talk all about the specifics and in many parts of the conversation. We start by talking about why we should study values, why studying values at all is important. We talk about it from the lens that she looks at it from, especially from a neuroscience lens. We talk about some of the strengths and limits of fMRI studies, where a lot of the research comes from. We talk about the value system in the brain, kind of where in the brain it is, how it works together. We talk about some of the overlap with the value system and the reward system. We discuss making choices, what that's like, how we do it, how it evolves. We, of course, talk about the self. Is there a constancy to the self? Does it evolve and change? We talk about making future choices, how we have values with others, which is where a large part of her book is situated, which is really, really important, and many other topics. Emily is such a delight. She's brilliant. I greatly enjoyed this conversation. I think it's offering something new to say in a topic and in areas that much has been said already. Her book is super well written, and she's doing just great research. Of course, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com, also on YouTube. So subscribe to the Substack, share with your friends. Plenty of other episodes in this world for you to listen to in the back catalog. And now I bring you Emily Falk. I am here with Emily Falk. Emily, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm greatly looking forward to talking to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sure. You have written a superb book. I really, really enjoyed it. It's called What We Value, the Neuroscience of Choice and Change. And this is just good science. This is what I'm all about. There's a lot of nonsense out there. There's a lot of good science in the book. There's some pictures of brains in there. There's a lot of good stuff. It's well written, obviously, credit to you for sure. So it's got all the things you could want, and we're going to talk all about it. Before we do, just tell listeners a kind of snapshot of who you are professionally, academically, and anything else that you want to share.
Yeah, thanks. I run Penn's Communication Neuroscience Lab, where we study attitude and behavior change, how people make decisions. I'm also the director of the Annenberg Public Policy Center's Climate Communication Division, where we think a lot about how to help people take action together to make the world better, and how we can build psychological tools for resilience. So things like a sense of autonomy and agency, how we can reduce loneliness and foster social connection in our communities, because those are things that are really helpful for solving any kind of big, hard problems, and climate is obviously one of those. And I'm the vice dean of the Annenberg School, so I get to support a really stellar faculty here that do a wide range of things.
So you're not busy whatsoever. You're very that is a lot of hats you're wearing, which is fabulous. That's great. So tell us. I'm sure a lot of that stuff will come through in the conversation, but on this book, you're tackling I would say probably a topic that is, I could imagine, difficult to study. Anytime you're trying to look at beliefs or values, or really people are interested in intentions, that's not easy to kind of get at. It's not, like behaviors are kind of sort of on the surface easy to study, but with values, those are kind of nestled deep within us. So why do you think it's important for people to understand value, choice, and not just for psychologists and neuroscientists like yourself and myself? Why do regular people need to know this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the assumption that values are this sort of big picture, high level thing that, the things that we think of when we think about values in the colloquial sense, things that we get from our communities, from our upbringing, from our education, that's one input to a calculation that our brains are doing all day, every day. And as a neuroscientist, when I think about value, I think it's worth clarifying that I mean something a little bit different than many people do. So, what I'm thinking about is a calculation that's happening in your brain that weighs all different kinds of inputs, including our core values, which might be things like compassion or care or spirituality. But also, what would be tasty right now? And would this be fun and rewarding in the immediate sense? So this calculation integrates emotional inputs, our sort of rational deliberations, what's happening around us socially, all kinds of things. And it outputs kind of what neuroscientists call a common value signal. And I think thinking about value in that way, like a neuroscientist thinks about value, helps us understand where our choices are coming from, and then maybe gives us a little bit more agency in what we want to weigh. So maybe we want to weigh our bigger picture goals and values more heavily, or maybe in this moment, it's okay to just like lean into the thing that's most hedonically pleasurable in the moment. But at least understanding how that calculation is unfolding, I think, gives us some insight about why we do what we do. And then for me, it also helps a little bit with compassion, like for myself, when I feel like I've made crummy decisions in the past, and also understanding why other people might be doing what they're doing that may not make sense to me on the surface, or may not seem like it's aligned with those stated or unstated bigger picture capital V values.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask about this, and obviously in the brain and what it looks like, but a small technical question is how you're kind of doing this. I don't always ask this, but I thought it would be helpful probably for listeners. How are we, obviously we have brain imaging studies, and you mentioned in the beginning of the book that your lab does fMRI studies to help us understand some of the concepts. I can remember when fMRI studies got kind of really big in the 90s, and everyone was like, oh, look, these parts of the brain light up. Wow, that must mean, is something going on here? And some people have put too much stock into that. Some people have depended on that. What do you think is, I guess, the limits or the strengths, of course, currently? Obviously, the 90s is, 35 years ago now. So, what do we know now currently about what fMRIs can tell us and what they can't tell us about what's going on in the brain?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I think it's really important to keep in mind when we're looking at what happens in people's brains, we're using a proxy, which is where blood is flowing in their brains, to say which parts are more or less active. And so the reason that that works is that all of our cells and our whole body need oxygen and glucose in order to function. And our blood brings those things to supply the cells with energy. And so by following where the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood is flowing, we can get a sense of which brain regions are more active or less active. But there are a number of limitations, both in terms of the technology itself, where we don't have, the millisecond resolution that certain other kinds of technologies for recording brain activity have. We have pretty good spatial resolution, but not to the level of, say, individual neurons. But I think the more important ones for the conversation that we're going to have actually have to do with human decision-making on the scientist side of things. So a lot of the early work in this space has been done on a relatively small sliver of humanity. So the main places that fMRI is possible are large universities with a lot of resources. And especially in the early days, it was really convenient to do research on students. And so that means that there's only sort of a small subset of humanity that really are disproportionately represented in these neuroimaging studies. So that's one big limitation. Another limitation is when we look at what happens in people's brains, there's been a ton of really excellent, what we call brain mapping, where people have worked to create tasks that manipulate particular kinds of psychological processes to kind of dial them up or down, turn them on or off, and to look at where in the brain we see more activation. And so that tells us, when I'm having you think about yourself versus identify the font in which a word is written, or when I'm having you think about what other people think and feel versus reasoning about objects that aren't social creatures, what kinds of brain regions are involved. So we have a pretty good map of where certain kinds of processes tend to take place. The place where things get trickier is then making inferences on the other side. So if we see activation in a particular brain region, that doesn't necessarily guarantee that the process we have in mind is what's causing that activation. So, an analogy that we sometimes use is to say that when it gets hot outside, we see that the temperature in the house goes up, right? And if I turn the heat on in the house, the temperature in my house goes up. But just because it's hot in my house, that doesn't mean I turned up the temperature gauge, right? It could be that it's August in Philadelphia and then it's hot in my house, right? So there's lots of different reasons why that could be true. And by the same token, if I see activation within, let's say, the medial prefrontal cortex, which is a brain region that I care a lot about, that is involved in thinking about my own thoughts and feelings. It's involved in thinking about other people's thoughts and feelings. It's involved in thinking about the kinds of valuation that we were just talking about. It's involved in various kinds of emotional processing. And so we can't precisely say, this is the thought that Xavier was having because we saw this particular activation. So those are a couple of the limitations, and I'm happy to talk about more of them as we unpack particular.
Yeah, no, it's really nicely said, and I think that that gives me a lot of confidence that folks can. A lot of times you'll hear people just rave about all these things, and it's like, well, wait, there's strengths and limitations to everything, and so that feels nice to hear, to say like, yeah, that does tell us a lot of great things. It's really wonderful, but like anything else, there's some limitations to it. So I think that's really really nice to say.
Yeah, I guess one other limitation that I would flag here is that the studies that we're going to be talking about today are all basically averages. And so we know that there's a lot of heterogeneity in how people's brains work, right? There's a wide spectrum of neurodiversity of different kinds, and people's brains individually work somewhat differently. And so the studies that we've done in social neuroscience, by and large, are concerned with like what's true for people on average. And that doesn't necessarily mean that every individual person's brain would work that way. And in fact, it certainly doesn't mean that. But we still think it's helpful to understand what's true on average, because it can give us some intuition about what kinds of interventions might work for people, or what kinds of ways might we think about how to kind of use that as a jumping off point for understanding the variability in the world.
Yeah, that's very, very important to note. People will read this and say, well, does this mean that my brain is this way? It's like, no, these are on average. And then, of course, looking at the, how within groups and between groups gets really messy as well. So, it's important to note the averages as well. I agree. So the value system, it's where is a crazy question, I guess. But as much as you can, how do we see the value system within the brain? Obviously, I don't think it's going to be localized to one part of the brain, but within the brain, what do we make of this value system? Where do we see it? Where, obviously the brain's interconnected, but what's kind of going on at different parts of the brain for our, value system within humans?
Yeah. So, some of the early work that laid the foundation to understand how it worked in humans was done in animals. So we see this kind of basic reward system in a number of creatures. We see it in, mice and rats. We see it in monkeys. And in the book, I talk a little bit about some of the early work in monkeys where they were making choices between different kinds of juice and different amounts of juice. And in these early studies, what was really cool was that before this work was done, we didn't know actually whether there would be many different brain systems that would handle all the different parts of a choice. Like, for example, the amount of sugar that's in a juice, the temperature of the juice, the quantity of the juice, and so on. And what these scientists found was that actually there was this common value signal that integrated over lots of different attributes that might be relevant to how much you want to consume, let's say, grape juice versus peppermint tea, or grape juice versus water. And that the subjective value that monkeys experienced fluctuated. So, for example, on Tuesday, a monkey might prefer grape juice to lemonade, let's say 2-1.
Mhm.
But then on Friday, maybe he hasn't had any fruit recently and now he prefers it 5-1.
Mm.
And the juice itself is still the same, but his subjective preference has changed. And what we see is that in parts of the monkey brain that correspond to these same kind of regions in humans, that there is fluctuation that corresponds to that subjective valuation. And so that was sort of early hints that there are all these different attributes that get fed into this final common pathway of choice.
Mm.
And then later work by neuroscientists studying human brains using fMRI found that in similar regions of the human brain, like the medial prefrontal cortex and the ventral striatum, among others, that when we see activation increase, that tends to scale with people's preferences for things like tasty snacks. So when people choose between, a bag of chips or a candy bar, the amount that they prefer one over the other scales with activation in these regions. And then really interestingly, and at the time, not obviously, it also is true when we compare things that aren't inherently comparable to each other. So, it kind of makes sense that your brain can compare different kinds of snack options to each other, maybe based on how tasty they are. But what if I said, would you rather go out to dinner and get a nice meal, or would you rather go to the movies? Like, those are not so inherently comparable. Like, one involves social experience, perhaps, where you get to eat something delicious. Another involves sitting in a dark theater where you get told a story. And it's not at all obvious from the surface that those things would be able to be weighed on this common scale in the brain. So when we think about what the value system is doing in the brain, it's doing this really sort of almost magical calculation of taking lots of different kinds of attributes, comparing them to one another, predicting what's going to be most rewarding to you, and then executing a choice.
You mentioned the reward system as well, and you use those, I think you mentioned in the book, interchangeably, value and reward. Based on what you were just saying, how are these similar, or what's the kind of overlap? And if you want, we can use an example. It might be a little bit complicated, but a lot of the times people will look at people that have had challenges with various types of addiction as there's a kind of reward system that they have, right? That they're getting all of these types of hits of sorts. If there's someone that has challenges with alcohol, they go and they drink alcohol and they're getting some kind of reward system kind of activated. I think people have sort of questioned or debated that as a more of a, well, maybe it's not quite like that. They're actually more, it's more of a struggle than it is getting a reward, that they're kind of, I don't want to say imprisoned to this kind of thing, but it's very much like I have to sort of do this as opposed to wanting it after a certain point. Again, it might be too in the weeds with the example, but when you think about things like, that's just the clearest example I have. I mean, you could use another example, but this idea of a reward system, and people have looked at this with different substances, cocaine, alcohol. I mean, you were using certain types of snacks or something, but I think maybe the substance could be helpful here as an example if you want to explain the similarities or differences.
Yeah, so neuroscientists use the words reward and value sometimes interchangeably. That's how I use it in the book. And sometimes people use value to refer more to like the expected outcomes, more like a cognitive process, and then reward to refer to like the actual outcomes of what you get. I think other researchers think about the process of calculating value more in these kind of deliberative cognitive terms, and think of reward as the more sort of basic pleasure-based thing that animals do. I mean, humans are animals, but I think we would probably, or some scientists might refer to the thing that rats are doing more in terms of basic low-level reward processes, and reserve that kind of subjective value judgment for more of the like deliberative cognitive kind of process. So I use them fairly interchangeably because I think that this kind of process of identifying what the possible choice options are, thinking, projecting, which of these is likely to be the most rewarding, and then keeping track of what actually happened, which are sort of three phases in value-based decision making. They do all involve some estimate of how rewarding this will be. Another way of saying that is like, how valuable will this be to me? And then as we think about how to kind of shape our own decision making, one of the things that we can do as humans is kind of play with the dimensions that we focus on. So, a default is to think about like the immediate reward, like what's going to happen to me right here, right now. Like if I'm choosing between a chocolate chip cookie and a bowl of broccoli, I might think about like how tasty is each of those going to be right now? Like what's the texture, like the very like physical experience that I'm going to have right now. And I may or may not make the same choice if I focus on that versus like what is me in 20 minutes going to feel like what's that going to feel like in my body, or what's me in 20 years if I make that choice over and over again, like how's my heart going to fare? And so, yeah, I think it's helpful to realize that there are these different aspects of value-based decision making, and that the kind of hedonic reward component is kind of at the core, but not necessarily everything that we might care about there.
So these three stages of value-based decision making, you can go over them. I guess the thing there is, a lot of the times people will say, well, I need to make the best decision or the best choice I need to have. And so you talk about positive prediction error and negative prediction. How do they play a role? And so, yeah, give us the kind of overview of the three kind of stages and how we're kind of looking at kind of negative, positive components of making those choices.
Yeah. So I was saying, when your brain's value system is considering a choice, first, it has to figure out what it's choosing between, right? So in some cases, a researcher puts choices in front of you that are very clear because we're trying to, really control the situation. So I might say, all right, Xavier, do you want to have $20 for sure right now? Or do you want a 50% chance of winning $50? And so you can think about like, okay, the choices are choice A or choice B. You might also think about all the other things that could be on the table. You could say, I don't want to be in this experiment anymore, and you could leave. But let's imagine right now that you're focused on these two choices, $20 right now or 50% chance at getting $50. So my brain has now identified these are the choices, and now it's going to think about like, well, what's the value of each of those choices, right? The $20 immediately and for sure has certain benefits, like we know we're going to get it. But a 50% chance at $50 has actually a higher expected return if you played that game many times, right? So on average, you'd end up with $25. So thinking about which of those is going to be more rewarding, and then you make your choice. So which one would you choose?
Probably option B.
Okay, so you're going to take the risk and roll the dice, and let's say you win. And so that's like really fun. And your brain, depending on, how confident you were about that going into it, that might feel even better than you thought it would, right? And so that would elicit activation that would spike, and we call that a positive prediction error, meaning that it was better than you thought it was going to be. And your brain stores that information so that next time you're in that situation and somebody asks you about making this gamble, you might think, wow, that felt really good. And when I say you might think, I'm not necessarily meaning literally that you would consciously think that, but that in your next choice, that information about your past experience would feed into it and might make you more willing to take the risky gamble. Whereas, let's say we played that same gamble and you lose. And you really thought you were going to win, right? You thought, like, I'm wearing my lucky socks, like, everything's with me today. But the outcome was surprising and it was negative. Then that would elicit what we call a negative prediction error. So in your brain, the value system would store that information and say, that actually was not as successful as I thought it would be. You can also think about other kinds of examples where, maybe you're a kid on the playground and you go up and you ask another kid to play tag with you. And you're not really sure how that's going to go. And maybe the other kid says yes, and you have an amazing time, and you get sort of this this boost, this positive prediction error. That was amazing. And now it's easier for you to go and take these like little social risks in the future. Whereas maybe the other kid says, like, that's stupid, tag's only for babies. And that feels horrible, right? And so then that might make you less likely to do that in the future. So this third phase of sort of updating based on new information is part of how we learn, right? It's part of how our past experiences shape our future decision making. So there's what's happening right here, right now, and then there's everything that I bring to this experience from my past history.
You're giving an example of a forced choice. Well, how does this look different if you're giving ranked choice or if you're giving more of a free range or free response? So in the example, option A or option B, but let's say I have options A, B, C, D, E, F, right? Or once you broaden it.
Sure. In life, I mean, it's not always clear exactly what the choice set is, right? So let's say I have 15 minutes after this conversation. There's effectively an infinite number of things I could do, right? Like I could go get a coffee. I could call my mom on the phone. I could paint a mural. Like, there's all kinds of things that I could get involved with. And some of those things are, easier to do. Some of those things might give me more immediate reward, like going and getting a delicious treat and eating it might be immediately pleasurable, but giving feedback to a student on some work that isn't going to pay off for another year or two, like that's a more delayed kind of reward. And so that first step of trying to figure out, like, what are the things I'm even choosing between involves a bunch of other sort of brain machinery that helps us figure out, like, what are the things that we're choosing between in the first place. But it's actually really important because, if I never consider the possibility that I could do something different than what I normally do, then that kind of limits the options that I have out of the gate, right? And so the following steps of like weighting the choices and prediction error and so on are constrained by what we're imagining the choice set to be in the first place. And I will say, just as a caveat, like I'm focusing on this kind of deliberative, value-based decision making that involves kind of conscious decision making between different kinds of options that we recognize as options. There's a lot of other behavior that we do that's handled by other brain systems out of habit. So after I do something many, many times, where there's a cue, there's something that I've repeated many times, and then initially some kind of reward, that becomes habitual and I can do it on automatic pilot. So for people who run a lot, getting up in the morning and putting on their running clothes, doing their running circuit is a different thing than for somebody who never does that and has to decide, on Saturday, am I going to go for a run or not? Like that's a totally different calculation in their brain. And so for things that we want to do a lot, handing those off to the habit system can actually like really reduce the friction a lot. And likewise, for things that we don't want to be repeating over and over again, if they turn into habits, can be harder to break.
I'm thinking of kind of some of my behaviorism training where you had all the different schedules of reinforcement, and variable ratio was always the best one, right? It's kind of what they use for the slot machines. It's like because you have like the fixed interval, and then you have like the variable interval, and all these different ones. But the variable ratio was always like the best one to try and like break certain patterns or to reinforce certain patterns. So it reminds me a bit of like what's going on for our brains of how we're dealing with habits and patterns is it's quite the labyrinth.
Yeah. I mean, like if you've ever like had a crush on somebody and like maybe they're going to text you back, right? Like, and then once in a while they do, and it feels amazing, and it like reinforces like, oh my God, I should be checking my phone, right? When in reality, like spending all this time on your phone, then you like start doom scrolling and
That's right.
but I think it's helpful to think about this in the sense that like the choices that we make deliberatively, if we take a step back and think about like, how do I want to spend my time and energy? Like for those of us that have the luxury of doing that, like when we do repeat certain things over and over again, or when we set up our environment to be conducive to certain kinds of choices, then those kinds of choices feed forward, right? So if we know that we want to develop, let's say, a running habit, then setting up the conditions where we like have the routine. This is the cue. It's 7:00 in the morning, and I see my shoes and I put them on and I go outside, and then afterwards I reward myself. And during the run, maybe I listen to an exciting audiobook. Like I can try to set up my context to make that easier and to eventually hand it off to the habit system. But when we don't have the time or the energy or the luxury of taking that step back, then can proceed on automatic pilot.
So let's talk about a very easy topic, the self and identity. This is something that has still kind of given some people so much confusion, lots of ideas, all these things. I guess for yourself, based on the research you've done from neuroscience perspective, I mean, how do you define the self? Is there a self? And when we think about our own identity or identities, how does this become helpful in decision making and choice?
Yeah, so within the brain, there are a number of regions that are part of what we call a self-relevant system. And that helps us think about what's me and what's not me. So scientists have studied this by looking at activation as people do things like judge whether different kinds of traits apply to them. Am I polite? Am I messy? Am I intelligent? Am I acrobatic? And we compare those judgments to when people are reading those same words, but making other kinds of judgments that aren't about the self. So a common comparison condition would be, is this word written in upper or lower case, for example? And so that allows us to control for the brain processes that unfold as we read a word and understand its meaning, but aren't about the self inherently. So when I make the judgment about whether I'm funny or whether I'm smart or whether I'm messy or rude, we see that there's a very consistent set of brain regions that get activated across people. And interestingly, this self-relevant system is very overlapping with the brain's value system. So to the point where when researchers have looked at training an algorithm using people's judgments of whether this is me or not me, they can then use that same model to predict whether somebody's going to say something is good or bad, and vice versa. And so this entangling between the self-relevance and the value system has a lot of implications, I think, for our behavior. So one is we know from decades of social psychology research, and then also from the corresponding neuroimaging research, that our identities feed into our decision making. So people tend to think of things that are me as, in general, good, and things that are not me as not good. And so, when people are thinking about what kinds of choices to make, one of the factors that might weigh in is like, is this compatible with my identity? Do people like me tend to do this particular thing? And so that can be helpful. Like, for example, When I was thinking about my own running life, my brother made a pitch to me about running faster. And I was like, that's not really a thing that I'm that interested in. And he really leaned in. He was like, a lot of academics are really good runners. You have all the skills. You can think about planning and you can think about hard work. And so he sort of reframed the nerd versus jock dichotomy that might have been more salient in my mind from, say, high school, to say, no, the identity that's really important to you, one of the identities that's really important to you is actually quite compatible with being a really good runner. And so in that way, convinced me to put more energy into this particular thing. But on the other side, since our culture and the norms in our culture are so strong about sort of what kinds of identities get to do certain kinds of activities, it can also constrain what we think is possible. So when we think about, does someone like me go skydiving? What kinds of people are risk takers, or, what kinds of people are investment bankers, or what kinds of people are poets? Like when I name those jobs, there's probably some kind of cartoon that comes into your mind of the kinds of people that tend to do those things. And so then if those are not identities that you identify with, then it might make you less likely to think that it's going to go well for you in the future. So when we think back to that kind of value-based decision making, our brain is constantly making these guesses about what's going to be rewarding, what's going to not be rewarding. And so that combination of self-relevance calculations intertwined with our value calculations can either open up possibilities or kind of close them off for us.
I guess the question I have here is that, do you think that there's a a stable core identity that we have? So, the person you were or I was at 5, right?
Mhm.
And we have elements of our temperament, our personality, etc. Is there something that has constancy over time, that it stays to
Yeah.
who is me
Yeah.
when I'm 85 and when I'm 5? Again, I'm not trying to smuggle in here some kind of soul or something like that. I don't
Sure,
I
sure.
don't
Yeah.
I don't believe in
Yeah.
that.
No, I
but
mean,
and that we have kind of revolving identities as we evolve and grow and change as well. So maybe when I was younger, I was a socialist Marxist, and now I'm a boring moderate or something, whatever. Um, you know, but in terms of who I am, I guess this kind of core aspect, there's something that stays constant over time. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the entity we are, right? We wouldn't be the self that we are, right? There has to be something that stays static, or not static, but it has to be constant.
sure. And this is a topic that has interested philosophers for millennia and psychologists for, a long time as well. So there's a ton of really interesting scholarship and debate about the nature of the self, as I think you know.
Hmm.
But for other folks who are thinking about this, I think the answer that I have is kind of both, right? On one hand, there is some core, there's a whole field of personality psychology, which is about what are the
Hmm.
aspects of us that are relatively stable, the things that tend to be true when we're very little all the way through old age.
Hmm.
Um, and, that sort of average baseline, it also, there's a lot of fluctuation around it, right? And so, there's one set of studies that I really liked where folks in Brent Hughes's lab created networks of traits. Like, how do different traits relate to one another? And so they had people make ratings of how much different words that were personality type words or trait like words um, depended on one another. So, for example, if somebody is kind, then maybe they're also going to be generous. And they constructed these networks of traits. And what they found is that across many people making these ratings, that there are certain ones that are fairly core, meaning that a lot of other traits depend on them. And then there were certain ones that are sort of more peripheral, like being witty. Like there's not a ton of stuff that if you know somebody's witty, that there's not necessarily like tons of other things that are obviously going to be true about them. And that people, were holding most tightly to those kind of core traits about themselves. So there may be a couple of like key ingredients or core values that are really important and that that we might hold on to while other things change. So in the book, I talk a little bit about Jenny Slate, who's an American comedian, and the ways that her sense of self sort of has stayed constant and fluctuated over time. Initially trying to do comedy on other people's terms and then realizing that she could create comedy that was more authentic and true to herself. Creating Marcel the Shell with Shoes On, which is a total delight for folks who haven't experienced Marcel. And Jenny talks a little bit about how Marcel has some of these traits that she thinks of as really core to her sense of self, like this utilitarian positivity, like he's resourceful and also like an optimist, right? But she also, when we talked about this, we talked a little bit about the transformation that can happen with life events. Like in Jenny's case, having her daughter, Ida, like was totally transformational for her in certain ways, right? For me, like losing a parent was a really big deal. And so we have these life events where our sense of who we are, there are parts of it that we hold on to, and there are parts of it that can transform. And so, a way that I think about this that I think is kind of helpful is that like both of those things can be helpful. Like holding on to the core sense of who we are and our core values can help us connect with other people or open us up in particular ways. But it can also be really freeing to let go of that bounded sense of self. Like this is something that comes up in a lot of contemplative practices like meditation, Buddhism, like letting go of a sense of fixed and bounded self can say, well, if there isn't this thing that is me and constant, then there's less to defend, right? There's less to push back on because, another way that having a strong sense of self can limit us is holding on to like the things that I did in the past were good and I should keep doing them and persist and not necessarily update or change my behavior. So yeah, I guess, Xavier, going back to the question that you were posing, like, I think both of those things can be true. We can have, a core sense of self that can remain relatively stable, and there's a lot of variability around it. So on some days, just like the monkey who prefers grape juice 2-1 on Tuesday and 5-1 on Friday, like some days I, just really want to like snuggle up in my house and, watch TV with my kids, and another day maybe I want to go dancing, right? So, so our preferences, our needs, and our sense of like what's important about who we are can also change and evolve. And I think there's a lot of power in noticing that.
Yeah, it reminds me, I had this really wonderful conversation on the podcast with Brian Lowry, who's a sociologist out in Stanford, I believe. And he has his whole view of the self is just socially constructed, and so we can change and evolve and be different selves, and it's nothing. He doesn't fully believe in the whole constant kind of thing. And we had a fun 2-hour debate. We had a 2-hour wrestling match on it, and it was quite fun, and it was cool because it's nice to hear that different perspective and stuff. I agree with you. I think kind of both are true, and I definitely feel there are things that are stable through time. But it's fun to hear different ideas and opinions on it.
Yeah, the thing that you're flagging about the kind of social self, I think, is also true, right? So a lot of our sense of who we are and what we value is also tied up in this third brain system, the social relevance system, that helps us understand what other people think and feel and what the norms are. And in that way, the people who surround us, and not only what they physically do, but also what we imagine they might be thinking or feeling, shape our own choices, our own preferences, what we think is desirable or cool or valuable.
Yeah.
And noticing how powerful those influences are, I think, can both be really surprising for people sometimes to realize like how much we're impacted by other people's behaviors and choices in terms of what we value, but also potentially freeing to think about, which of those kinds of influences do we want to actually give weight to.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely agree. I think it is how much influence and impact people have on each other and on our sense of self and our identity is tremendous. So I guess in terms of, there's this interesting piece in the latter part of the book about choice, right? You say our value system helps us make choices. Now in the present, you kind of alluded to this, excuse me, earlier, but also how we'll make future choices. So, how do we connect with the person we want to be in the future in the moment? You can talk a little bit if you want about perspective memory, this idea of remembering to do something or remembering how this would come in shape of our value systems. But yeah, how do we have choices now that impact who we're going to be? I mean, you could take an obvious example of this. It's like, well, do I get married? Well, in theory, that's a lot for the rest of your life. I mean, if you're holding to the kind of standard monogamous kind of relationship. Do I have kids? Again, that's a life. I mean, how does someone make that decision at 22 for the entirety of their life? These are huge decisions. And so, yeah, I mean, how does our value system help us make these choices now that impact our future?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not actually aware of any brain scanning studies that have thought about the kinds of choices that are as consequential as what you're describing, like
it's a big choice,
choosing a partner for the rest of our lives or whether to have kids. But the kinds of things that neuroscientists have looked at have to do with things like monetary decisions. Like we know, for example, that people tend to prefer rewards sooner if possible. So if I say to you, Xavier, you can have $20 right now, or you could have $30 next week. Which would you choose?
I mean, I'll wait a week. I'm fine.
Okay, great. So you're going to be a little bit patient. And you're going to make $10 extra. But if I said to you, you can have $20 today, or you can have $20.02 in a week, that might be a harder choice.
I'll probably take the $20 now. I can go get a nice lunch with $20.
Yeah. So for the extra 2 cents, like maybe it's not worth it. And people vary in terms of how patient they tend to be. So going back to this like trait like thing, right? There are some people who tend to be fairly patient and will wait a long time for just a tiny bit more reward. And there are some people who tend to be fairly impatient and want the rewards right now. And on average, by default, our brains tend to weigh the immediate rewards more heavily. And I think it's really important to know that because so much of the time we try to will ourselves to do something unpleasant now in service of a longer term goal, right? So in the financial domain, we're like, trying to convince people to save for retirement, perhaps. In the health domain, maybe we're trying to convince people to eat healthier, get exercise, or quit smoking, or do any of these kinds of things, which when we frame it as like, do it for your future self, like you don't want to get cancer, you don't want to get heart disease, you want to live a long life. Like, yeah, okay, maybe, but like that's so far in the future. And our brains treat our future selves actually the way that we treat other people, like people who aren't us. So it's like, yeah, like sometimes I'm willing to do something to benefit that other person who exists in the future, but it's hard to do that when it's unpleasant for the person that's me right here, right now. And so some of the ways that scientists have thought about overcoming this involve making the decisions that are going to ultimately benefit us in the long run more pleasurable now. So for example, Caitlin Woolley and Ayelet Fishbach have some lovely work looking at health decision making and people choosing between healthy snacks that are really tasty or less tasty. And so when people choose the most healthy option, but it's one that they don't actually like, it's hard to sustain that behavior. Whereas when they choose a snack that's relatively healthy, but they also like it, then that makes it rewarding both now and in the future. And there's other research out of Stanford where, just even the way that we talk about things, like labeling different kinds of things in a dining hall, calling it like healthy turnips versus calling it like balsamic glazed, maple turnips or something. Like when people named the vegetables with things that made it clear why you'd want it right now, like the taste aspect of it, people made a lot more vegetable selections in the dining hall than when we just focus on the delayed reward of it being healthy. So that's one thing, is like thinking about how do we make the thing that is compatible with our longer term goals pleasurable now. Like on the exercise front, thinking about, going for a brisk walk and having some me time, or listening to a really exciting and fun audiobook while I do it, like something that's going to make that experience fun now, as opposed to like, oh, I have to do this so that I don't get heart disease when I'm 70. Can be advantageous. And I think this is another place where the fact that we're social creatures and that social rewards are so powerful can play in. Like when we, go for that brisk walk with a friend, that is so much more enjoyable than when we try to force ourselves through these kinds of things alone. And so, this sort of bringing the rewards into the immediate is one strategy. Another is to connect with that future self more deliberately. Like humans have this amazing infrastructure in our brains to engage in travel across, space and time and social distance through our imaginations. And so, when we think about the future more vividly, it can make us more patient. And there was really cool research out of Stanford where a team gave people avatars of themselves and aged those avatars so that you could sort of get this more concrete sense of what your future self might look like. And that made people more patient saving for retirement.
Yeah, I can say for myself as I got older, when I was younger, like most people in their early 20s, I was a very active person, but I ate whatever I wanted. Hamburgers and pizza and whatever, right? And I didn't eat terribly, but I, in terms of like every day, but I didn't think about it. I was like, oh, I'm young, whatever. I'm still the same weight. I still body looks fine, whatever. And then I realized as I got older, I remember the first time I went to the doctors and he said, oh, he's like, your cholesterol's very high. And I was like, oh, okay. What's that mean? Like I had an idea of it. He's like, well, it's like, this and this, you have to fix this. And so we kept playing with this. And I said, well, why is this so hard to go down? And I'm exercising, I'm eating better. He goes, well, he said, unfortunately, you got to pay the bill at some point. And I was just like, what do you mean? And he goes, well, how did you eat when you were in high school and in your 20s? I was like, oh, I was terrible. I drank Red Bull all the time. I was like, I didn't care. I was $150, and I was, super thin and I was, active. And he was like, but that stuff builds over time. And it was just like, well, why didn't anybody tell me that? He goes, people probably did. And I was like, you're probably right. But then now that I'm, much older, very, close to my 40s, it's like, oh, I have to like really make sure I don't keep adding to all that stuff I did to my body. It is interesting where it's like, even when you're young, of course, we want to live well and we want to enjoy ourselves. And of course, it's fine to have indulge in some things. But I think being a bit more mindful of things and having that idea of like, well, what is my future self? How is this gonna? How do I not beat up my future self? Physically or medically or even emotionally or socially? I think it's terribly instructive for people to say, not to give them more anxiety about things, but to say like, at least be more mindful of what this could look like for you.
Yeah, I mean, and the other thing about that, right, is like you're still pretty young, right? So like hopefully you got many decades ahead to take care of that future self. But in doing it, I think the path to success is really, not thinking of it as like I'm going to muscle through these next 30 years, but rather like what are the things that are pleasurable or enjoyable about the healthier options now? Like Hedy Kober's team has done this series of really beautiful studies looking at when people focus on like how crispy and crunchy the broccoli is going to be or whatever, versus just thinking about like that it's the healthier option, it increases people's willingness to pay and the value that they place on those healthier options. So, using the social levers that you have of hanging out with people who are into, making those kinds of choices, and then thinking about how you can be that for other people too.
Yeah, I can definitely say when I've traveled, I feel this a lot, where it's like, oh, the things I normally back home would kind of not really look at. It's like, oh, this actually looks very appealing, and there's something aesthetically nice about it. And then, oh, wow, this tastes really well, and it's really filling. And it's like, okay, how do you continue to translate that instead of just saying like, oh yeah, it's that kind of, sort of like a kid mentality of like, oh, my fruits and vegetables, and but I just want all the, it's more of like, yeah, changing sort of how you view it. And I totally agree. I think the social component is huge. So my final question here is how do we continue to learn more about values, make improved decisions with others, and what, if anything, that maybe we didn't hit or we didn't get to, that you really want people to get from your book, that you really say, you spent time to write this wonderful book. What is that one or two major things that you want people to kind of walk away with from what you've written?
Yeah, thanks. I think we've touched on this a little bit, but I would say there's a lot more in the book about that social connection aspect. So there are 3 parts in the book. The first part is about those basic neural systems that we talked about, the value system, the self-relevance, and the social relevance system. Then the middle part of the book is about choice, like how do we shape the choices that we make to increase mostly our own health and happiness. And then the third part of the book is about connection. How do we connect with other people to improve our own lives, but also, how do we do that in a way that helps us innovate, that helps us shape the culture that we're part of? And like I was just saying, that noticing the choices that we make ripple out and affect the choices that other people make. So how do we really invest in our communities and shape the world that we want to live in? And so I think there's just, so much power in understanding that kind of social connection and what it can do for us, how getting different kinds of ideas and perspectives as we make our choices can really change the way that we think and what is possible for us. So that's probably the most important thing that I think we haven't talked about as much, but that I do talk about quite a bit in the book.
Firmly agree. Yeah, the last, I guess the second and third part of the book is a lot about the social component and how we're connected, and a little bit of some cultural stuff, and so and what that's like. And I can say that was one of my parts I liked the most in the book, is that it was like, yeah, how does all this kind of apply with our interconnectedness, and how do we work with people, and how people impact us? And so it's brilliant.
Thanks,
Emily, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really enjoyed our conversation. True delight, and for all your wisdom and all your research and your just great way of explaining it. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really wonderful to be here with you.
Absolutely.